Shane Drumgold, the Director of Public Prosecutions who oversaw the Lehrman trial, has stood down. He stood down in the wake of the Sofronoff Inquiry and its damning findings against him. The inquiry was an investigation into misconduct in relation to the Lehrman trial. This includes allegations of misconduct against the police, the DPP's own conduct, i.e. Shane Drumgold's own actions, and whether there was political interference into the prosecution. The inquiry was precipitated, in fact, by Shane Drumgold himself, in what has now turned out to be a rather large own goal. That is, Shane Drumgold called for this inquiry, and the inquiry made adverse findings against him. The Sofronoff Inquiry found that the allegations he brought against the police were without merit. Now, Shane Drumgold's allegations against the police were the initial reason for the inquiry even getting off the ground. The allegations included assertions that the police acted in a biased manner, or in a manner that would benefit the defence, rather than acting as impartial truth finders. However, the Sofronoff Inquiry found that they, quote, performed their duties in absolute good faith, with great determination, although faced with obstacles, and put together a sound case. That is, the police had no adverse findings against them, and all of the allegations against the police were found to be without merit. The Sofronoff Inquiry did, however, make some adverse findings against Shane Drumgold, at least as far as the reporting has gone. Now, of course, Shane Drumgold denies any wrongdoing, and he disputes the conclusions reached in the report, so it is worth bearing in mind that he does not agree with the report outcomes, and I'll leave it up to you to determine for yourselves whether or not you agree with them. But it is still worth going over what the report found, and why it is that Shane Drumgold was basically left in an untenable position. However, the reporting is rather damning. For example, there are reports that he, quote, did not act with fairness and detachment that was required from his role. And the reason that would arise is because a DPP is supposed to act impartially. They're supposed to act as a truth finder for the court. They're not supposed to act in a win-at-all-costs basis. They're supposed to act as a truth finder. Their first duty is to the court, not to obtaining a prosecution at any cost. The report also found that he erred in attempting to withhold a police report, the Mueller report, from the defence, which could have had exculpatory evidence. Now, the Mueller report was important to the defence, and it turns out the defence only found this slightly by accident, by sifting through various prior documents. The Sofronoff Inquiry found that Shane Drumgold treated criminal litigation, quote, as a poker game in which a prosecutor can hide the cards. Here, quote, he constructed a false narrative to support a claim of legal professional privilege. That is, Shane Drumgold should have disclosed this Mueller report to the defence, but he attempted to not do so. And that is improper because he has a duty of disclosure. And the reason for this is the court is there to find the truth. The court is not there to find a prosecution per se. The prosecution needs to be meritorious. The prosecution shouldn't be done if, for example, there is not a basis for a prosecution. His job is to help the court find truth, not to win at any cost. Now, in an attempt to hide that Mueller report from the defence, the Sofronoff Inquiry found that he, quote, preyed on a junior lawyer's inexperience in order to get that junior lawyer to swear an affidavit that did not comply with the relevant rules that would be required in relation to legal professional privilege. That is, Shane Drumgold attempted to argue that the Mueller report was covered by legal professional privilege, and therefore he did not need to disclose it to the defence. However, there was no basis for any claim of legal professional privilege because that was for the police to claim if there were to be any privilege at all. And since the police were not claiming legal professional privilege, there was no basis for Shane Drumgold withholding that report. That is, he should have complied with his duty to disclose. The inquiry also investigated various other matters. For example, Lisa Wilkinson's now infamous speech at the Logies. Now, the inquiry was rather scathing of Shane Drumgold in this case. The report indicated that Walter Sofronoff, the inquiry runner, found that he preferred the evidence of the TV presenter Lisa Wilkinson and prosecutor Sky Jerome over Shane Drumgold. Quote, I do not believe any part of Mr. Drumgold's purported recollection unless it is consistent with the recollection of those witnesses, the Sofronoff Inquiry indicated. Sofronoff appeared to not be wholly believing of Shane Drumgold's evidence. Now, all of these factors put together paint a picture of potential misconduct. They paint a picture of, at the very least, sloppy behaviour. A picture where Shane Drumgold had a win-at-all-costs type attitude toward the court. A picture where Shane Drumgold would prefer to win rather than necessarily ascertain truth. At least that is the picture that appears to emerge from the reporting of the Sofronoff Inquiry. Now, it has been reported that these allegations, if they hold up, could lead to a criminal prosecution against Shane Drumgold for perverting the course of justice. However, of course, we need to wait for the full report to come out for us to really be able to reach a conclusion about that. And of course, that itself would be a legal matter that would need to go before the courts. We should of course note a couple of things. It's been reported that the Sofronoff Inquiry leaked to the media, to both the ABC and the Australian, before Shane Drumgold had a copy of it. Now this of course would place him in a slightly difficult position. It is very difficult for him to respond to allegations when he doesn't know exactly what those allegations are. So we have some sympathy for him there. However, he was there during the inquiry, so he would know to some extent what was likely to be expected. Furthermore, Shane Drumgold denies any wrongdoing, and he disputes, at least at a high level, the findings in the Sofronoff Inquiry. Now his resignation letter is, however, a little bit odd. The bulk of that resignation letter pertains to the criminal justice system at a very high level. It talks about the prosecution rates for particular crimes. Now, while it does appear some crimes have very bad prosecution rates, that is really beside the point. That would not excuse any wrongdoing. That would not excuse a win-at-all-costs approach. That would not excuse withholding evidence from the defense that should have been disclosed. The court is there to find truth, not to seek a prosecution at any cost. Innocent people should not be behind bars, and a prosecutor should know that. But of course, he does dispute any wrongdoing. Now, Shane Drumgold's resignation statement starts off by saying, "In November 2022, I wrote to the ACT Chief Police Officer. In it, I set out serious concerns I then held about the way an investigation and trial of the DPP versus Lehrman was being handled. In my mind, the handling of the case was reflective of a chronic problem in Australia with the way our legal institutions deal with allegations of particular crimes. Now, we might well be right that particular crimes have had some issues with how they've been handled. It might well be right that some crimes have bad prosecution rates. However, like I've indicated, that's a little bit beside the point, because the question here is about the prosecutor's conduct and whether or not the prosecutor behaved properly. And bad prosecution rates in the past don't exclude misconduct now, if indeed that is what occurred." He also goes through various statistics about prosecutions, which, like I've said, are really not actually that pertinent right here. Shane Drumgold also feigned surprise that he was investigated as part of this inquiry, and in fact that there were adverse findings made against him. In his resignation statement, Shane Drumgold says, "Instead of, for example, finding adverse findings against the police or investigating the criminal justice system, instead, the findings were largely focused on myself." But again, that should not necessarily really be a surprise. The Sofronoff Inquiry did look into the police and did not find any evidence of misconduct in this particular case. And while it could have been that there were issues with prosecutions in the past, in other cases, and potentially there were bad prosecution rates, that is not really pertinent to this particular case, because the question is, how did everyone conduct themselves in this particular prosecution and this particular trial? And that includes the conduct of the prosecutor. Now, pertaining to the findings in the report, Shane Drumgold states, "While I acknowledge I made mistakes, I strongly dispute that I engaged in deliberate or underhanded conduct in the trial or that I was dishonest." He also says, "Although I accept that my conduct was less than perfect, my decisions were all made in good faith, under intense and sometimes crippling pressure, conducted with increasingly unmanageable workloads." Now, I'll leave it to you to decide what exactly you think is the case. He also states in relation to the release of the report, "The preemptive release of the report to the media has denied me procedural fairness. It has deprived the ACT government of the opportunity of considering my conduct objectively." Now, like I've indicated, I have some sympathy here. It is very difficult for him to respond to allegations when he does not know the contents of the report. On the other hand, however, the leak appears to be somewhat akin to that of a whistleblower. It appears, at least at surface level, the ACT government might have been trying to bury the report. And if in fact the government were trying to bury this report, were trying to keep it from the public, then the leak would be somewhat akin to that of a whistleblower, to my mind in any case. And of course, it does seem a little bit ironic, given the findings within the Sofronoff Inquiry, that Shane Drumgold now is complaining himself about being denied due process. But regardless, this whole situation has culminated in Shane Drumgold resigning as the Director of Public Prosecutions in the ACT. I'll leave it to you to determine whether or not his resignation was warranted and of the nature of his conduct.